The Royal Palace of Madrid, 1665. The cold stone corridors echoed with the murmurs of courtiers as Margaret Theresa of Austria, barely 14 years old, gazed at her reflection in the Venetian mirror in her chamber. Her pale face, framed by the ashen blonde hair, characteristic of the Habsburgs, already bore the early signs of what the servants whispered about in hushed tones: the prominent chin, the closely set eyes, the thick lower lip. "Your Highness, His Majesty the King requests your presence," announced Doña Ana de Mendoza, her lady-in-waiting, interrupting her thoughts. King Philip IV, her father, and also her uncle awaited her in the throne room. At his age, the monarch appeared weary, his face marked by the burdens of an empire beginning to crumble. "Margaret, my daughter," the king said in a grave voice, "the preparations for your journey to Vienna are nearly complete. Your marriage to your uncle Leopold will ensure the continuity of our dynasty and strengthen our ties with the empire." The young princess nodded silently. From birth, she had been groomed for this fate, to marry her uncle Leopold I of Austria, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, continuing the tradition of consanguineous marriages that had defined the House of Austria for generations. "Father, is it true what they say about our blood?" Margaret Theresa asked, her voice barely audible. The king's face darkened. "You must not heed the gossip of the court. Our lineage is the noblest in Europe, and it is our duty to preserve it." But Margaret had heard the rumors, the whispers about her brother Charles, only 4 years old, the heir to the Spanish throne, born of her father's marriage to Mariana of Austria, who was both his niece and his new wife after the death of Elizabeth of Bourbon. The young prince could barely walk or speak, and the royal physicians kept his numerous ailments a closely guarded secret. That night in her chambers, Margaret Theresa studied the family portrait hanging on the wall. The faces of her ancestors, all bearing the same distinctive features, gazed at her with a mix of pride and melancholy. Her great-grandfather, Philip II, her grandfather, Philip III, her father, Philip IV, all had married their daughters, sisters, and nieces within the family to maintain the dynasty's power and possessions. "Are you ready for bed?" Your Highness asked Doña Ana, brushing her hair. "I must be," Margaret replied with resignation. "It is my duty to Spain and the House of Austria." Meanwhile, in another wing of the palace, the royal physicians attended to young Prince Charles, whose convulsions had grown more frequent. Dr. Francisco de Herrera shook his head with concern as he observed the child who, if he survived, would one day be Charles II of Spain. "The blood is too concentrated," he muttered to his colleague. "4 generations of marriages between cousins and uncles with nieces, the cost is too high." As the date of her departure approached, Margaret Theresa spent hours in the royal chapel praying for strength. She couldn't help but notice the pitying and curious glances from the court ladies, as if she were a victim destined for sacrifice. "They say the winters in Vienna are colder than here," remarked the Duchess of Albuquerque while adjusting the Infanta's dress. "You'll have to get used to many new things, Your Highness. What worries me most are the children I must bear," the Emperor, Margaret confessed. "I've seen what's happening to my brother Charles." The Duchess fell silent for a moment, searching for the right words. "Your Highness will fulfill her destiny as all the princesses of Spain have done. It is the price of power and the glory of our empire." On the eve of her departure, Margaret Theresa was granted a private audience with her brother Charles. The pale, frail boy could barely hold his head up without assistance, his overly large eyes and a deformed face, looking at her with a mix of confusion and sadness. "Sister," he stammered with difficulty, extending a trembling hand toward her. Margaret held back tears as she took his small hand. "I will always pray for you, Charles." That night, as her ladies prepared her trousseau for the journey, Margaret Theresa studied a map of Europe spread across her desk. The vast Habsburg Empire, divided between its Spanish and Austrian branches, was held together by the blood ties forged over generations, an empire built on political marriages that now seemed to be paying the biological price of inbreeding. "What troubles you, Your Highness?" asked Doña Ana, noticing her pensive expression. "I wonder if our fate is written in our blood," Margaret replied, tracing her finger along the route from Madrid to Vienna, "and if there's any way to escape it." Vienna, 1667. Winter had draped the imperial city in a white mantle, and the windows of the Hofburg Palace were partially frosted, distorting the view of the snow-covered gardens. Margaret Theresa, now 16 and Empress of the Holy Roman Empire, gazed at her swollen belly as her Austrian ladies dressed her for that afternoon's diplomatic reception. "Your Majesty must take care of her health," remarked Countess von Harrach in halting Spanish. "The physician has recommended rest." Margaret shook her head. "The Emperor expects my presence. I cannot fail him." 2 years had passed since her arrival in Vienna, and life as the wife of Leopold I, her uncle and cousin, had proven as challenging as she had feared. The Emperor, 11 years her senior, was a stern man more devoted to music and state affairs than to his young Spanish wife. Yet he had diligently fulfilled his duty to produce an heir. Her first pregnancy had ended in tragedy 6 months earlier, when little Infanta Maria Antonia was born weak and struggling to breathe. Now expecting her second child, Margaret Theresa battled the fear of bringing another child into the world, marked by the Habsburgs' genetic curse. His Imperial Majesty, the Emperor Leopold, announced a chamberlain, and the ladies bowed deeply. Despite his imposing presence, Leopold's face also bore the characteristic Habsburg traits, the prominent chin, thick lips, and aquiline nose. "How are you feeling today, dear niece?" he asked in Spanish out of courtesy. "Well, Uncle," Margaret replied, still using the familial term in private despite being his wife. The child moved strongly. "That is a good sign." "We need a male heir," Leopold said briefly, placing his hand on the Empress's belly in a rare gesture of intimacy. "The envoys from Madrid bring news of your brother." Margaret's face tensed. "How is Charles?" "He lives, but his condition worsens. He can barely eat, and the physicians fear he won't reach adulthood." Leopold replied with clinical detachment. "The regent Mariana is desperate. If Charles dies without heirs, the Spanish succession could spark a European war." Margaret closed her eyes, feeling the weight of history on her shoulders. As Philip II's eldest daughter, she was next in line for the Spanish throne if her brother died without issue. Her children with Leopold could unite both Habsburg branches, fulfilling a dynastic dream spanning generations. "That is why we must ensure this child is born," Leopold added, looking at her intently. "For Spain, for Austria, for our house." That evening during the reception, Margaret Theresa noticed the French envoy watching her with a mix of curiosity and pity. France under Louis XI lurked like a hungry wolf waiting for any sign of weakness in the Habsburg Empire. "The French ambassador seems particularly interested in your Majesty's health," remarked Countess von Harrach. "France is always interested in our weaknesses," Margaret replied. "My cousin Louis XIV has not forgotten that my father rejected his marriage proposal in my favor." Later, alone in her private chamber, Margaret reread a letter from her mother, Queen Regent Mariana. The words about Charles's condition were heart-wrenching. The 6-year-old boy could barely stand, his head too large for his fragile body, unable to chew solid food due to his deformed jaw. A soft knock interrupted her reading. It was Sor Maria de Agreda, the Spanish nun, who had accompanied her from Madrid as her spiritual advisor. "May I enter, Your Majesty? Please, Sor Maria. Your company is always welcome." The nun sat beside the Empress, noticing the letter in her hands. "News from Spain, I presume. My brother is worsening?" "The physicians fear he won't live long," Margaret said, placing a hand on her belly. "And I'm afraid for this child." Sor Maria took the young Empress's hands in hers. "God's will is mysterious, my child, but remember that even in royal families, blood needs renewal." "What do you mean, marriages between such close kin? The Church permits them with papal dispensation, but nature has its own laws," the nun said cautiously, aware her words could be deemed treasonous. "Some say the health of our Prince Charles and the struggles of your family are the result of too many generations marrying within." Margaret fell silent, pondering the implications. Her entire upbringing had been geared toward preserving the dynasty, maintaining power through familial alliances. Questioning this practice was to question the very foundation of the Habsburg monarchy. If that were true, she said at last, it would mean our dynastic pride has been our ruin. "It is not for me to judge the designs of great royal houses," Sor Maria replied prudently. "I only pray that God grants you a healthy child." That night, as the palace slept, Margaret slipped into the imperial portrait gallery. Illuminated by the moonlight filtering through the windows, the faces of generations of Habsburgs from Rudolph I to Ferdinand III watched her, each bearing the increasingly pronounced traits of consanguineous marriages. She paused before the portrait of her grandmother, Maria Anna of Bavaria, one of the few women to enter the family from outside. Her face displayed a different beauty unmarred by the Habsburg features. New blood, Margaret murmured, recalling Sor Maria's words. A sharp pain in her belly doubled her over. She clutched the wall tapestry for support as warm liquid ran down her legs. Help, she cried, but her voice was faint in the vast empty gallery. Please, someone. The next hours were a blur of pain and fear. The imperial physicians summoned in haste struggled to stop the bleeding. Drifting between consciousness and unconsciousness, Margaret overheard fragments of their urgent whispers. Too soon? The child won't survive. We must save the Empress. When she awoke, Leopold's grim face was the first thing she saw. We lost him, he said bluntly. It was a boy. Margaret closed her eyes, tears streaming down her cheeks. I'm sorry, Uncle. I've failed you. We will recover from this, Leopold replied, though his tone lacked conviction. You are young. There will be more chances. But as the physicians whispered in a corner, Margaret realized something graver had occurred. Their expressions revealed a diagnosis they dared not share with the emperor. What aren't you telling me, doctor? She asked when Leopold had left. The chief physician approached her bedside cautiously. The premature birth caused damage, Your Majesty. It will be difficult to conceive again. The news hit her like a stone. Her sole purpose as empress to bear heirs to the empire now seemed unattainable. In that moment, Margaret understood she too was a victim of the Habsburgs' genetic curse, not only through the physical traits she inherited, but through the fragility afflicting her family. Inform the emperor, she said, her voice breaking. He must know the truth about his wife and niece. Madrid, 1673. The gardens of the Buen Retiro Palace offered brief respite from July's stifling heat. Charles II, now 12 and officially King of Spain, though under his mother's regency, walked with difficulty, leaning on a specially designed cane for his deformed body. Beside him, physicians and courtiers watched each step with anxiety. His Majesty has shown improvement today, remarked the Duke of Medina Celi to the royal physician, though both knew it was a polite lie. In her private study, Queen Regent Mariana of Austria, Charles's mother and Leopold's sister, reread the latest letter from Vienna. The news was devastating. Margaret Theresa, her stepdaughter and niece, had died after giving birth to her fourth daughter, another frail child unlikely to survive long. God has taken our dear Margaret, Leopold had written. Her body, exhausted by childbirth and illness, has finally succumbed. She was only 22. Mariana let tears flow freely. With Margaret's death, hopes of uniting the Spanish and Austrian Habsburg branches through a healthy heir had vanished. Now everything rested on Charles, the last male of the Spanish Habsburg line, a boy whose survival seemed a daily miracle. Has Your Majesty seen the latest letters from Vienna? Asked Cardinal Portocarrero, entering the study. Yes, Mariana replied, drying her tears. My stepdaughter is dead, and with her 4 of her 5 children. Only Maria Antonia survives, and she too is frail. The cardinal remains silent, aware of the dynastic crisis's gravity. We must find a wife for King Charles as soon as possible. Despite his condition, he must try to produce an heir. What woman would marry him? Mariana asked bitterly. All of Europe knows his state. He can barely speak coherently, cannot chew his food, and the physicians doubt he's capable of consummating a marriage. France will offer one of its princesses, the cardinal replied. Louis XIV sees our weakness and prepares to claim the Spanish inheritance when Charles dies without issue. I'd sooner ally with the devil than with France, Mariana snapped. Meanwhile, in the gardens, Charles suffered another of his frequent seizures. The physicians rushed him to his chambers, administering the usual remedies that did little to ease his condition. The king is worsening, Dr. Enriquez later reported to the Queen Regent. His convulsions are more frequent, and his mind seems increasingly absent. How long does he have? Mariana asked, her voice a whisper. It's impossible to say, Your Majesty. It's a miracle he survived this long. He could live a few more months or astonishingly many years. The Habsburg constitution is unpredictable. That night, Mariana convened a secret meeting of the Council of State. Spain's grandees and ministers gathered in a private chamber far from prying ears. We must discuss the monarchy's future, the Queen Regent began. My son, our king, will likely have no issue. We must decide Spain's fate before foreign powers do it for us. The Duke of Medina spoke first. With all respect, Majesty, we should not wait. The king is young, but he will not improve. I am his mother, and no one suffers more than I. To say this, Mariana interrupted sharply. But we must be realistic. The Spanish Habsburgs will end with Charles. A heavy silence fell over the room. For nearly 2 centuries, Spain had been ruled by the House of Austria. The idea of a dynastic change was almost unthinkable, yet now it seemed inevitable. There are 2 options, Cardinal Portocarrero continued. Either the Austrian Habsburgs inherit the Spanish throne, unifying the empire, as in Charles XXI's time, or we seek a new dynasty among Europe's royal houses. France will push for a Bourbon, warned the Marquis de los Villas. They've already begun positioning their pieces on the diplomatic board. As the nobles debated, Mariana gazed at a family portrait dominating the room's wall. Philip IV, her late husband, stood surrounded by his children, the deceased Margaret Theresa, the ailing Charles, and the numerous illegitimate offspring he had sired with various mistresses. Ironically, these bastards, born of unions without the prestige of consanguinity, enjoyed better health than the legitimate heirs. Perhaps, Mariana said, interrupting the heated debate, our pride was our mistake. We thought the Habsburg blood so precious it should only mix with itself, and now we see the result. An uncomfortable silence followed. Questioning the dynasty's marriage practices was to question the very basis of its power. What is clear, the Queen Regent continued, is that we must look to the future. If Charles cannot have heirs, we must decide who will rule Spain after him, and we must do it now, while we still have some control over our destiny. In Vienna, meanwhile, Emperor Leopold the First prepared for his second marriage. With Margaret Theresa dead and only one surviving daughter from their union, he needed new heirs. This time, however, he chose Claudia Felicitas of Austria-Tyrol, a distant cousin whose blood was less concentrated with Habsburg lineage. The physicians say the new empress enjoys excellent health, remarked Count von Lamberg to Prince Lobkowitz as they observed the wedding preparations. Perhaps this time we'll have strong princes. It's a pity we lost the chance to unite the Spanish and Austrian crowns, Lobkowitz replied. The death of Empress Margaret Theresa was a blow to our dynastic ambitions. Not as severe as what will happen when King Charles of Spain dies without heirs, von Lamberg retorted. France, Bavaria, they'll all claim their share. It could spark a war that redraws Europe's map. Back in Madrid, Charles II spent hours gazing at his ancestors' portraits in the Royal Gallery. Despite his often clouded mind, he had moments of lucidity where he seemed to grasp the tragedy of his existence. Mother, he asked one day, why am I different from other children caught off guard? Mariana struggled to respond. Finally, she took her son's deformed hand in hers. Because God has chosen to test our faith, my son. Each of us carries a cross, and yours is especially heavy because you are the king. The courtiers talk when they think I can't hear. Charles continued, his words halting due to his deformed jaw. They say I'm cursed by our family's blood. Mariana closed her eyes, feeling the weight of generations of dynastic decisions that had led to this moment. You are not cursed, Charles. You are the result of our history, our choices. I will die soon, Mother. We all die someday, my son, Mariana said, gently squeezing his hand. But while we live, we must fulfill our duty. Your duty is to be the best king you can for as long as God grants you. That night, as the palace slept, Charles II dragged himself to the royal chapel. There before the altar, the last of the Spanish Habsburgs prayed not for his health or life, but for Spain and the future of an empire he knew he could not sustain much longer. In Versailles, thousands of miles away, Louis XIV of France received detailed reports on the Spanish king's health and the succession debates in Madrid. With a calculating smile, the Sun King began plotting the strategy that upon Charles II's death would place his grandson Philip of Anjou on the Spanish throne, ending nearly 2 centuries of Habsburg rule and forever altering Europe's balance of power. The curse of the Habsburgs' dynastic inbreeding had sealed Spain's fate. The obsession with preserving blood purity had led to the extinction of one of history's most powerful dynasties, proving that even kings cannot defy the laws of nature indefinitely.